At a busy airport gate, a flight attendant humiliated a black teenage girl in front of dozens of passengers, accusing her of being in the wrong place. The girl said nothing. No arguments, no shouting. Just one quiet phone call. Within hours, security rushed the gates, flights were canceled, executives panicked behind closed doors, and by the end of the day, one of the country's biggest airlines had completely fallen apart. How did one moment destroy an entire empire? The truth behind what happened will leave you speechless. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a new one. The airport was filled with the usual rush of people dragging suitcases, announcements echoing through loudspeakers, and the smell of coffee from a nearby cafe. At gate 42, a young black girl named Brielle Jenkins stood quietly by the side, clutching her backpack against her chest. She wore a faded blue hoodie, black jeans, and old sneakers that squeaked slightly when she moved. Her big brown eyes kept flicking nervously between the departure board and the paper ticket she held tightly in her hand. Brielle wasn't trying to get attention. She stayed close to the seating area, careful not to block anyone. The first-class line was a few feet away, roped off neatly, filled with business people in suits and travelers with expensive luggage. She knew she wasn't supposed to board yet, but she didn't want to stand too far back and miss the announcement. The crowd moved like a restless river, but suddenly a voice cut through everything. "Hey, you!" a woman shouted. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A flight attendant in a sharp navy uniform with a badge that read Colleen Briggs stormed toward Brielle, her polished shoes clicking loudly on the floor. "You can't stand here," Colleen barked, waving her clipboard at Brielle like it was a weapon. "This area's for first class only. Economy's back there with the others." She said it loud enough so everyone nearby could hear. Brielle froze, her cheeks burning. She wasn't standing in the first-class line. She was still a few feet away, not bothering anyone. She opened her mouth to explain, but Colleen wasn't done. "Show me your ticket," she snapped, "or I'll have security escort you out." Brielle's hands trembled slightly. She hated making scenes. She hated being stared at. People nearby shifted uncomfortably, some pretending to scroll through their phones, others stealing quick looks at the scene unfolding. No one said anything. Not a single voice stood up for her. Brielle drew a slow breath and reached into her hoodie pocket. But instead of pulling out her ticket, she pulled out a small flip phone. Her fingers shook slightly as she pressed a single button. The phone rang once, then again. On the third ring, a calm male voice answered. "It's happening again," Brielle said quietly. That was all. She hung up without another word. Colleen folded her arms and smirked as if she had won something. "That's what I thought," she said under her breath, loud enough for the passengers in the first few rows to hear. A businessman nearby, a man named Grant Peters, glanced up from his laptop and frowned slightly but said nothing. A middle-aged woman named Janice Monroe, sitting near the window, bit her lip nervously but didn't move. Brielle stood still, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't cry, she didn't shout. She just looked down at her scuffed sneakers, willing herself to stay calm. Colleen shook her head in disgust and turned away, thinking the problem was solved. But what she didn't know, what no one around them knew, was that Brielle's quiet phone call had already started something that none of them could stop. Something that would not only change her life but would bring the entire airline crashing down before anyone even boarded the plane. A heavy silence floated around the gate area after Colleen Briggs walked away, but it did not last long. Within minutes, a disturbance near the security entrance caught everyone's attention. Two men in black suits, moving with clear purpose, pushed through the crowd. Behind them, a tall woman in a dark gray pantsuit followed, her expression sharp and unreadable. The three of them moved swiftly toward gate 42. Passengers stepped aside instinctively, sensing something serious was happening. Colleen spotted them approaching and straightened her back, smoothing her uniform with quick, nervous hands. She plastered on her most professional smile, ready to explain how she had handled the situation. The tall woman stopped directly in front of Brielle Jenkins. Her name tag, neatly pinned to her blazer, read Camilla Rhodes, Vice President of Customer Experience. Without even glancing at Colleen, she bent slightly toward Brielle. Her voice was low but firm. "Miss Jenkins, are you all right?" Brielle nodded silently, her throat too tight to speak. Camilla placed a steady hand on Brielle's shoulder and turned sharply toward the flight attendant. "Miss Briggs," she said, her voice slicing through the tense air, "please step aside immediately." Colleen's face turned a shade paler, but she obeyed, confusion flickering across her face. She tried to speak, but the words died in her mouth when she saw the two men in black suits flanking Camilla. One of them carried a leather folder with the airline's logo embossed in gold. Passengers sitting nearby leaned in, pretending not to watch, but their curious glances said otherwise. Grant Peters lowered his laptop lid. Janice Monroe clutched her handbag tightly, sensing something much bigger was happening. Camilla spoke again, this time addressing the entire gate area. "There has been a misunderstanding. I apologize on behalf of the airline for any mistreatment one of our guests may have experienced. Further action will be taken immediately." Her words were calm, but the tightness around her mouth revealed her anger. Colleen opened her mouth to protest, but Camilla lifted a hand sharply. "Enough." Security officers approached from the side, speaking quietly to Colleen. Her hands trembled slightly as she was asked to follow them. She looked around desperately, but no one came to her defense. The crowd that once ignored Brielle's humiliation now watched silently, their expressions cold and judgmental. As Colleen was led away, Brielle stood still, feeling the stares of the passengers, but also feeling something else. A slow, steady shift in the air around her. For the first time that day, she no longer felt invisible. Camilla leaned down slightly, speaking so only Brielle could hear. "You're not alone in this. Just stay strong a little longer." Brielle nodded, clutching her backpack even tighter. She didn't fully understand what was happening yet. She only knew that the call she had made had set something powerful into motion. And what was coming next would reach far beyond a single flight, a single gate, or even a single employee. The walls around the airline were about to crack, and no one, not even the ones at the very top, would be able to stop it. Within the hour, the news of an incident at Gate 42 began spreading through the airport like wildfire. Workers whispered by the coffee stands, travelers checked their phones more often, and even some flight crews paused their conversations when glancing toward the commotion. But inside the operations office on the third floor of the terminal, the situation had already moved from whispers to alarm bells. Behind a long glass wall, a short, heavy-set man named Douglas Reeves, head of airline security operations, paced back and forth while shouting into his headset. "Who authorized an executive team to approach a passenger without clearance?" he barked. His forehead was shining with sweat despite the air conditioning. Across the room, his assistant held up a hand to get his attention. "You need to see this," she said, her voice tight. Douglas stomped over to her desk, frustration boiling just beneath the surface. On the monitor was a live feed from a popular social media platform. Someone at the gate had uploaded a video of Colleen Briggs shouting at Brielle Jenkins. Even worse, it was already gaining thousands of views per minute. Comments flooded the screen, angry and disgusted. Some posts demanded boycotts, others tagged news stations. A few pointed out the disturbing way no one had helped the young girl until executives showed up. Douglas felt his stomach twist. This was no longer just a minor gate argument. This was a full-blown public relations nightmare growing by the second. He grabbed his phone and made a call, his fingers tapping rapidly against the desk. "Get me Brian Holt," he ordered. Brian was the CEO of the airline, and he hated being disturbed. But this time, Douglas had no choice. The problem was no longer small enough to hide under a report or fix with a free flight voucher. This could destroy them if not handled immediately. Meanwhile, back at the gate, Brielle sat quietly in a small, private room near the boarding area. Camilla Rhodes had personally brought her there, away from the stares and whispered conversations. A gentle-looking woman named Deborah Lane, from the Passenger Relations Department, handed her a bottle of water and spoke softly. "We're handling it, sweetheart. You don't have to worry anymore." Brielle nodded but said nothing. She wasn't afraid anymore, but she wasn't comforted either. She knew the call she made wasn't just to report mistreatment. It had reached someone far bigger, someone whose influence could shake more than just a few employees. While Deborah spoke in hushed tones to Camilla in the corner of the room, Brielle stared out the small window at the runway. Planes lined up, one after another, engines roaring, tires squealing against the concrete. It was strange how life outside still moved forward, unaware that inside these walls something was breaking apart. Far across town, in a glass tower that overlooked the city skyline, a private phone buzzed on a large wooden desk. The man who picked it up, Leonard Walsh, didn't work for the airline. He owned part of it. And when he saw the name flashing on the screen, his face darkened. He picked up the call with a grim voice. "I know," Leonard said before the caller even spoke. "I saw the video. Pull the emergency trigger today." Across the airport, in secret meetings and quiet phone calls, plans that had been hidden for years began to move. And all because a teenage girl in a worn-out hoodie made one quiet call. A call that carried the weight to bring giants down. At the terminal, passengers grew restless as more flights were delayed without clear explanation. Announcements overhead became less frequent and more cautious. Gate agents whispered urgently into radios. The normal busy rhythm of the airport had shifted into something heavier, something tense, as if the walls themselves sensed that something was collapsing from within. Inside the private room, Brielle Jenkins remained seated, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't asked for any special treatment, yet now people tiptoed around her like she was carrying something fragile and dangerous at the same time. Camilla Rhodes stayed nearby, her posture stiff, her phone vibrating almost non-stop. She kept checking it, her frown deepening with every new message. Suddenly, the door opened, and a man in a sharp black suit entered. His name badge read Garrett Moore, Regional Operations Director. He carried a leather binder under his arm and wore an expression that tried to be calm, but failed. Garrett gave Brielle a nod of respect before pulling Camilla aside for a quiet conversation. Brielle listened without trying to, catching broken sentences. Words like containment, emergency measures, and board meeting floated through the air like dust motes. Whatever was happening was bigger than even she had expected. Garrett stepped back toward Brielle and cleared his throat. "Miss Jenkins," he began carefully, "we want to personally apologize for what you experienced. Please understand we are doing everything in our power to make this right." Brielle looked up at him with steady eyes, offering no response. She didn't need apologies made of nervous words. She didn't need bottled water or kind smiles after the damage was done. Garrett shifted uncomfortably. "Would you allow us to move you to a private suite while we handle a few urgent matters?" he asked. Brielle simply shrugged, indifferent. She stood up slowly, slinging her backpack over one shoulder. As she followed them down a narrow hallway, she noticed employees moving quickly around them, some with fear on their faces, some whispering into headsets. The closer they got to the executive lounge, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary situation. Meanwhile, in the airport's restricted administrative wing, chaos was spilling into every office. Phones rang non-stop. Lawyers scribbled furious notes. Someone printed pages of screenshots from social media platforms, piling evidence that the story had already reached major news outlets. At the center of the storm, CEO Brian Holt slammed his hand onto the table, glaring at the team assembled before him. His voice was low but cold enough to make the room shudder. "I want the names of everyone involved. I want a list of every executive who failed to report this up the chain. And I want a full risk assessment. Not tomorrow, not in an hour, and now." An executive named Peter Collins, head of public affairs, shifted nervously in his chair. "Brian," he said carefully, "there's something you should know. The girl, she's not just any passenger." Brian's jaw clenched. "Then tell me, now." Peter swallowed hard. "She's the granddaughter of Eleanor Jenkins." The room went dead silent. Eleanor Jenkins. The same Eleanor who had once been one of the original founders of the Aviation Corporation. The same Eleanor who had quietly held controlling shares through shell companies after retiring from public view. A woman whose influence stretched farther than anyone dared to admit. Brian Holt stared at Peter, his fists tightening. In that moment, he understood. This wasn't a scandal they could bury with a statement or an apology. This was personal to someone powerful enough to end them with a single command. And judging by how fast the situation was moving, that command had already been given. The hallway leading to the executive suite was almost empty, but every few steps Brielle could feel eyes following her. Nervous, confused, scared. Some workers tried to look busy, pretending to check papers or type messages, but their glances were sharp, stealing pieces of the unfolding disaster with each blink. Camilla Rhodes walked just a step behind her, her posture tense. Her phone pressed tightly in her hand as if waiting for the next explosion. Garrett Moore led the way, walking faster than he needed to, like he was trying to get out of the public eye before things grew worse. When they reached the suite, Garrett opened the heavy glass door and motioned for Brielle to step inside. The room was far from the noisy chaos outside. Thick carpet swallowed the sound of footsteps. The walls were lined with sleek, expensive furniture in soft colors, meant to calm important guests. A long window stretched across one side, offering a clear view of planes slowly taxiing on the runway, their movement steady and indifferent to the storm building inside the terminal. Brielle sat down carefully on the edge of a leather couch, her backpack still hugged against her chest. She stared out the window, pretending not to notice Camilla whispering urgently in the corner of the room with another executive who had just rushed in, a slim woman named Clarissa Doyle. Clarissa wore a crisp black skirt and blazer, her short blonde hair pinned neatly back. Her face was tense, her words fast and sharp. Brielle could only catch pieces of their conversation, but the tone said everything. They weren't planning a quick fix anymore. They were preparing for impact. Meanwhile, across the city, Leonard Walsh leaned back in his office chair, watching multiple news feeds play on screens lined up across one wall. His office was silent except for the low hum of computers and the quiet ticking of a heavy clock on the wall. Reports about an incident involving a miner and airline staff flashed again and again, growing sharper by the minute. Protest groups had already picked up the story. Influencers and celebrities were beginning to post about it. Legal firms posted phone numbers encouraging witnesses to step forward. Leonard's phone vibrated on the desk. He picked it up without looking at the caller ID. "It's done," he said calmly into the receiver. "We pull the funding immediately, terminate the pending merger talks, leak the internal audits if needed. They buried too much for too long." He ended the call without waiting for a response. Then he picked up a thick file marked private and placed it neatly into a briefcase. Years of silence were ending today. It wasn't just about Brielle. It was about every ignored complaint, every hushed-up incident, every decision made to protect the company instead of the people who trusted it. And now, there would be no one left to cover it up. Back at the airport, Camilla stepped toward Brielle with a thin smile stretched across her face. "Miss Jenkins, can I get you anything? Water? Food? A different flight? We have a private lounge ready if you prefer." Brielle shook her head slowly. Her voice when she spoke was low but steady. "I'll wait right here." Her words, simple as they were, felt heavier than anything in the room. Camilla hesitated, then nodded and stepped back, giving her space. At the boarding gates, chaos tightened its grip. 2 major flights were canceled without warning. Rumors spread fast, talk of investigations, suspensions, even mentions that the airline might shut down certain operations. In a nearby cafe, Grant Peters scrolled through his phone, staring wide-eyed at the live news updates. Janice Monroe sat across from him, her coffee untouched, her face pale. "This isn't just about a flight delay," Janice said, her voice shaking slightly. This feels bigger, like something is breaking apart." Grant nodded slowly, unable to look away from his screen where news headlines flashed in bold letters. "Major airline under fire after viral incident." Insider sources report executive shakeup. Shareholders demand emergency meeting. The passengers didn't know it yet, but their tickets would soon be useless. Their flights would never leave the ground. Their loyalty points, their platinum memberships, all the perks they had collected would be worth nothing. Because somewhere in the silent war rooms above the terminal, the people in charge weren't thinking about customers anymore. They were thinking about survival. And for the first time, survival might not be possible. The airport, once a place of steady rhythms and smooth operations, now felt like it was sinking into quicksand. Security officers moved quickly through the halls, whispering into radios and blocking off areas without giving explanations. Staff members in tailored suits rushed between terminals, faces tight, each one hoping they weren't the next to be called into an office and questioned. The chaos was growing, not from noise, but from the thick, heavy silence pressing down on everyone. In the executive suite, Brielle Jenkins sat calmly on the couch, her backpack now resting by her side. She watched the clouds shift outside the tall windows. She didn't flinch when the door opened again, this time allowing a group of important-looking men and women to enter. One of them was Russell Denton, the airline's vice president of legal affairs. His gray suit was wrinkled at the sleeves, his hair messy from running his hands through it too many times. Behind him was Monica Reyes, the chief communications officer, holding a tablet full of notes she could barely manage to organize. Camilla Rhodes stood straighter as they entered, her jaw set in a grim line. "They're here," she said quietly, more to herself than to Brielle. Russell stepped forward, forcing a tight smile onto his face. "Miss Jenkins," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "we would like to formally extend our deepest apologies for the experience you've had today. It does not reflect our company's values." Brielle said nothing. She simply looked at him with eyes too tired to be impressed by soft words. Russell cleared his throat. "We are prepared to offer compensation, full refunds, future travel vouchers, a private written apology from the airline's board." Brielle raised her hand slowly, cutting him off without saying a word. The room froze. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade into silence. "You think this is about a free flight?" she asked softly. Russell's face reddened. Monica Reyes shifted uncomfortably, clutching her tablet closer to her chest. No one dared to answer. Brielle stood up slowly, her small frame barely reaching Russell's shoulder, but somehow she seemed taller than anyone else in the room. "You don't even know what's about to happen," she said quietly. A knock came at the door before anyone could respond. A nervous assistant poked his head in, holding a tablet with shaking hands. "Sir, you need to see this," he said, directing it toward Russell. Russell grabbed the tablet and his eyes widened as he scrolled through the screen. Monica leaned in, and her hand flew to her mouth as she read. In bold letters, the headlines blazed. "Leaked documents reveal airline's history of discrimination complaints hidden from public. Federal investigation into airline's hiring practices launched. Major shareholders withdraw support amid scandal." Screenshots of internal memos flashed on the tablet, memos showing that complaints like Brielle's weren't isolated. They were part of a pattern, a system that trained employees to look the other way, or to cover things up before they grew too loud. Camilla glanced at Brielle, realization sinking deep into her bones. This wasn't just about a girl being shouted at by a gate. This was the collapse of everything the company had built on a foundation that had rotted underneath their feet. Garrett Moore, still lingering in the corner of the room, finally found his voice. "Who leaked this?" he whispered hoarsely. Monica answered without looking up. "It doesn't matter. It's too late." Across the city, in a sleek conference room filled with polished mahogany tables and shining silver chairs, Leonard Walsh sat calmly while a dozen shareholders screamed at one another. Phones buzzed nonstop. Lawyers shuffled thick folders across the table, each containing lawsuit threats, demands for resignations, and notices of financial withdrawal. Leonard simply sat back, hands folded, watching the storm he had unleashed tear through the room. At the airport, an official announcement crackled over the loudspeakers, shaky and hesitant. "Attention, all passengers. Flight 317 to Boston has been canceled. Flight 220 to Chicago has been canceled. We apologize for the inconvenience. It wasn't just a few flights. Soon, every screen in the terminal would start blinking with red letters. Canceled. Delayed. Canceled. Janice Monroe stood near a window, clutching her handbag as she watched the departure board crumble into chaos. She glanced at Grant Peters, who was still glued to his phone, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. "They're falling apart," Janice whispered. "This whole airline, it's falling apart right in front of us." At gate 42, Brielle simply stood by the window, her reflection staring back at her, calm and unmoving. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just waited, knowing the worst was still yet to come. The executive suite grew colder by the minute. Every time a new notification popped up on someone's device, the faces of the executives tightened even more. It wasn't just a bad story anymore. It wasn't even just a scandal. It was a full collapse in motion, and no apology, no voucher, no carefully worded statement could stop it. Russell Denton rubbed his forehead with shaking hands, looking 10 years older than he had that morning. Monica Reyes kept tapping nervously on her tablet, scrolling through the avalanche of news reports, each worse than the last. Camilla Rhodes stood near the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her gaze locked outside where planes taxied slowly on the runway, oblivious to the disaster unraveling inside. Garrett Moore moved toward the door but stopped when it swung open. This time it was not another assistant. It was a man with a badge clipped to his belt, marked with bold letters, Federal Aviation Investigator. His name was Martin Blake, and his arrival made the room shrink instantly. Martin didn't waste time. He pulled a letter from a thin leather folder and handed it directly to Russell without a word. Russell scanned it, his hands trembling. It was a formal notice of federal investigation, immediate suspension of certain operating licenses, request for full access to staff records, internal communications, passenger complaint files, and hiring documents. Failure to cooperate would result in an immediate grounding of all aircraft bearing the airline's brand. Russell stumbled back, dropping into a chair like his legs could no longer hold him. Monica gasped audibly. Camilla closed her eyes for a long moment, the weight of the paper sinking deep into her chest. Martin Blake looked around the room, his expression cool and professional. "You can either start cooperating now, or you can prepare to watch your entire fleet get locked down within the next 24 hours, he said. His voice was calm, but the warning underneath was sharp as broken glass. Brielle remained still, seated now, her fingers running lightly across the stitching of her backpack. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The airline's walls were already cracking, and no one inside could stop it from crumbling. Meanwhile, passengers throughout the airport began noticing the change. Lines at customer service desks grew longer. Angry voices echoed off the high ceilings. Parents tried to calm crying children as screens blinked red, canceling one flight after another. Employees whispered to one another in panicked voices. Rumors floated. The company was being shut down. Authorities were involved. The entire airline might collapse before the end of the day. In the first-class lounge, Grant Peters paced back and forth near the window, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He was on hold with a corporate travel agent who had no answers, only apologies. Across the room, Janice Monroe spoke quietly with a group of passengers, trying to organize a plan to rent buses or find alternative flights. Fear was setting in, a fear bigger than missed connections or delayed vacations. It was the fear of being left stranded by a company that had promised them trust and service, and was now dissolving into smoke. Inside the executive suite, Russell finally found his voice. We can fix this," he stammered. "We just need to release a statement. Immediate suspension of the employee involved, commitment to diversity training, outreach to advocacy groups." Martin Blake raised a hand, silencing him with a single motion. "You don't understand," he said flatly. "You're too late. The investigation isn't about one employee. It's about the culture you built, protected, and buried complaints under. This isn't one bad apple. This is a broken orchard." Russell's mouth opened, but no words came out. Garrett Moore sat down heavily next to him, covering his face with his hands. Monica Reyes looked at the door like she wanted to bolt, but knew there was nowhere left to run. Camilla Rhodes stayed near the window, her shoulders slumped, her reflection blending with the gray clouds gathering outside. And Brielle? Brielle sat quietly in the middle of it all, unmoving, watching the empire that had tried to belittle her tear itself apart at the seams. Back across the city, Leonard Walsh placed a final call. It was short, just a few words. Liquidate the remaining shares. He didn't need to say more. The message was clear. The airline wasn't going to survive the night. And it had all started with a shout, a tear, a quiet call made by a girl in a hoodie who refused to be humiliated one more time. The first wall had fallen, but the real collapse hadn't even hit yet. It was coming faster than anyone realized, and when it landed, there would be no rebuilding what was lost. Not for them, not ever. As the afternoon slipped into early evening, the mood inside the airport shifted from confusion to anger. Passengers crowded the service counters, their voices rising louder with every unanswered question. Airline staff struggled to maintain control, but it was clear they were losing the battle. Some employees simply removed their name tags and disappeared into the crowds, wanting no part of the disaster they could no longer hide from. The departure screens, once filled with colorful rows of flights and destinations, now looked sick with rows of blinking red. Canceled. Entire terminals were shutting down. Boarding gates stood abandoned, the metal detectors silent, the conveyor belts still. An entire company, once proud and towering, was collapsing in real time, and the witnesses were thousands of stranded travelers with phones in their hands, recording every moment. Inside the executive suite, the room grew heavier with every second. Russell Denton slumped further in his chair, staring blankly at the federal notice in his lap. Monica Reyes kept pacing near the far wall, biting her thumbnail until it bled. Garrett Moore buried his head in his hands while Camilla Rhodes sat stiffly on the arm of a leather chair, staring into nothing. Martin Blake remained near the door, his arms crossed, the badge on his belt glinting under the fluorescent lights. He wasn't there to save them. He was there to document the fall. Suddenly, another assistant rushed in, pale-faced and breathless. He handed a printed sheet of paper to Martin, who scanned it quickly before handing it to Russell without ceremony. Russell's fingers trembled as he read the page. His lips moved silently over the words, as if trying to make sense of them. When he finished, he let the paper fall from his hands and flutter to the carpet. It was a formal notice from the Department of Transportation. Effective immediately, the airline's operating certificates were suspended pending investigation. All aircraft were ordered to return to base. All flights were grounded. They had not even made it to the end of the business day. Across the airport, stunned announcements crackled through the speakers. Attention passengers. Effective immediately, all flights with Crestline Airways have been suspended. Please proceed to the service desks for further instructions. We apologize for the inconvenience. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It was the death knell. Grant Peters heard the announcement mid-call with his travel agent. He let the phone drop from his ear, staring at the terminal board, blinking out one flight after another. Around him, passengers shouted in disbelief, some demanding refunds, others demanding explanations. Children cried. Elderly passengers slumped into chairs, exhausted and defeated. Janice Monroe clutched the sleeve of a passing airport worker. What's happening? What are we supposed to do? The worker shook his head sadly. I'm sorry, ma'am. They're shutting everything down. The airline's finished. Inside the executive suite, the final pieces began to fall into place. Monica collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Garrett sat silent, staring at the floor. Russell finally rose, his knees cracking from the strain, and approached Brielle, who still sat calmly, untouched by the panic around her. His voice cracked when he spoke. Miss Jenkins, is there anything we can do to fix this? Brielle looked up at him. Her voice was soft, but it carried across the room like a strike of lightning. You could have fixed it a long time ago, she said, but you didn't want to. You didn't believe it mattered until today. Russell flinched, but he knew she was right. Every report they had ignored, every passenger complaint they had buried, every staff warning they had laughed off. It had all come due, and no amount of money or promises could buy them a way out now. Brielle stood up slowly, sliding her backpack onto her shoulder. Camilla instinctively moved to help her, but Brielle gave her a small shake of her head. She didn't need help. She never needed it. What she needed was respect, and that had come too late. As Brielle walked toward the door, Martin Blake stepped aside, giving her a clear path. Every executive in the room, every staffer, every assistant turned to watch her. Not because she had raised her voice, not because she had thrown a tantrum, but because she had stayed calm when the world around her lost its balance. Brielle paused at the door for a moment, turning back to face them. Her next words were simple, but they would live in the minds of everyone who heard them for the rest of their lives. Respect isn't something you can fake when you're scared. It's something you prove when you think no one's watching. And with that, she stepped out into the hallway, leaving the wreckage behind her. The airline, once a symbol of pride and luxury, now stood as nothing more than a cautionary tale. And Brielle Jenkins, the girl who was told to go back where she belonged, had shown them exactly where she belonged, standing tall while they fell. The long hall outside the executive suite felt strangely empty as Brielle walked through it, her footsteps soft against the thick carpet. No security guards rushed to stop her. No executives chased after her with desperate offers. No fake smiles tried to smooth over what had been done. The world inside that building had crumbled, and everyone who had helped build it was now too busy trying to survive the wreckage. She moved steadily through the halls, passing rows of framed photographs on the walls. Proud moments in the airline's history. Smiling employees shaking hands with politicians, planes gleaming under sunny skies, awards for service, safety, excellence. But all of it now felt hollow, like a museum for a fallen kingdom, filled with ghosts of promises never kept. Outside the suite, the terminal had completely transformed. Passengers who had been confused were now angry, demanding refunds, shouting at anyone still wearing a uniform. Some tried to book flights on other airlines, but the sudden flood of stranded travelers made seats scarce and prices skyrocket within minutes. Airport police officers moved through the crowd, trying to calm situations before they grew violent. Several travelers were crying openly. Elderly couples who didn't know how they would get home, parents trying to soothe scared children, business people furious about missed meetings. Brielle kept walking, weaving through the rising storm like a quiet shadow. As she passed gate after gate, she heard pieces of conversations float past her. They're saying the airline's being sued already. Whole thing is being shut down. It's over. My brother's flight got turned around mid-air. They told them to land at the nearest airport. This is gonna be all over the news tonight, just wait. Brielle didn't stop. She knew the real storm wasn't out here in the terminal. It was happening behind closed doors, in courtrooms, in offices, in conference calls that were already ringing out like alarm bells across the country. At the airport entrance, where travelers usually lined up for taxis and shuttles, news vans now crowded the curb. Reporters shouted into microphones, camera lights flashing as they tried to capture the chaos. Microphones were shoved in the faces of passengers as they exited the terminal. Some vented their anger, others just shook their heads and kept walking. A young reporter caught sight of Brielle, recognizing her from the blurry photos now flying across social media. She rushed forward, microphone in hand, a cameraman hurrying behind her. "Miss Jenkins," she called breathlessly, "can you tell us what really happened? How do you feel about being the center of all this?" Brielle stopped and turned slowly toward the reporter. The lights from the camera made her squint, but she didn't step back. She didn't run. "I'm not the center of anything," Brielle said quietly. "The truth is, that's what matters. And the truth was always there. People just didn't want to see it." The reporter opened her mouth to ask more, but Brielle had already turned away, walking toward the sidewalk where private cars waited. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, its windows tinted dark. The back door opened. and a man in a plain black suit stepped out. His name was Victor Hale, the personal advisor assigned to Eleanor Jenkins, Brielle's grandmother. He nodded respectfully as Brielle approached. Without a word, she slid into the back seat. Victor closed the door gently behind her, then climbed into the front passenger seat. The SUV pulled away from the curb smoothly, leaving behind the flashing lights, the shouting voices, the mess. Inside the vehicle, the world felt quiet again. Victor glanced at Brielle through the rearview mirror. "She's proud of you," he said simply. Brielle leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes, letting out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She didn't feel proud. She didn't feel victorious. She felt tired. Tired of fighting battles that shouldn't exist anymore. Tired of proving her worth to people who judged by appearance before character. But she also felt something else. Freedom. Not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been silenced, brushed aside, made invisible. The walls had cracked, the lies had been exposed, and the empire that thought itself untouchable had fallen to its knees because one girl refused to bow her head. Across the city, news stations buzzed with breaking alerts. Crestline Airways shuts down operations amid scandal. Federal investigators confirm widespread discrimination cover-up. Major shareholders file lawsuits against Crestline executives. In boardrooms and government offices, powerful people scrambled to distance themselves, erasing connections, issuing statements of regret. But it was too late. The damage was done. And all the while, somewhere far above it all, a quiet storm named Brielle Jenkins moved on, not because she had been given power, but because she had claimed the dignity that was always rightfully hers. The city lights blurred past the SUV windows as it sped down the highway. The airline's buildings, once tall and proud, now stood like empty shells against the night sky, their lights flickering uncertainly in the growing darkness. The world wouldn't forget what happened here. Brielle didn't need them to. The truth had already spoken, and nothing could bury it again. The SUV drove through the city without stopping, weaving past busy intersections and flashing billboards that now displayed breaking news headlines. Everywhere Brielle looked, the collapse of Crestline Airways was written in bold, unforgiving letters. On one corner, a giant digital screen replayed grainy footage of the incident at Gate 42. Another billboard showed a simple, cold statement. Crestline Airways, operations suspended indefinitely. Inside the car, Victor Hale drove with steady hands, occasionally glancing at Brielle through the mirror but saying nothing more. There was nothing to say. The damage spoke louder than any words could. They passed the airline's corporate headquarters on the edge of downtown, a massive glass tower that had once symbolized pride and success. Now, it stood like a hollow monument to arrogance. Reporters and angry ex-employees gathered near the entrance, their signs flashing under streetlights. Justice delayed is justice denied, and we knew you ignored. Brielle sat in silence, watching it all. She thought back to the moment at the gate, to Colleen Briggs shouting at her in front of dozens of strangers. She had felt so small then, so exposed, but that humiliation had bloomed into something bigger, something no one could have predicted. Not even her. Victor pulled the SUV into an underground parking garage beneath a tall, quiet building. He parked near a private elevator guarded by two security officers in dark suits. They nodded to Brielle respectfully as she stepped out. The elevator ride was smooth and silent, the city noise fading away as they rose higher. When the doors finally opened, they revealed a large, warm office lined with bookshelves and framed photographs. Sitting behind a heavy oak desk was Eleanor Jenkins. Her hair was silver and short, her eyes sharp and clear despite her years. She stood slowly when Brielle entered, leaning slightly on an elegant cane carved from dark wood. "You did exactly what you needed to do," Eleanor said, her voice steady and proud. Brielle crossed the room without hesitation. Eleanor opened her arms and Brielle stepped into her embrace. For a moment, the world outside disappeared. After a long, quiet hug, Eleanor led her to a pair of leather chairs near the window, where the city stretched out in lights and distant sounds. "Tell me how you're feeling," Eleanor said gently. Brielle stared out the window for a moment before answering. "I don't feel like I won anything," she said. "It doesn't feel like a victory." Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding without needing more explanation. "Because it was never about winning," she said. "It was about standing. And you stood when it mattered most. That's something very few people manage to do, no matter how much power they have." Brielle leaned back in her chair, exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. "Will it even matter?" she asked quietly. "Or will they just rebuild and pretend none of it ever happened?" Eleanor's gaze sharpened. "They might try. People always try to patch the cracks instead of tearing down what's rotten. But it won't work this time. You force them into the light. Even if the name fades, the truth is out now. And it will ripple farther than you can see today." Brielle looked down at her hands, the small scars on her knuckles from years of fights she didn't ask for. In school, on the streets, at doors that were slammed in her face. She never wanted to be a symbol. She had just wanted fairness, a chance to walk into a room and not be treated like a mistake. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping lower. "This was never about just one airline. You hit something deeper. Every boardroom, every company that thought appearances mattered more than character is feeling that tremble right now." Brielle listened, the weight of Eleanor's words sinking into her chest. It was a bigger fight than she could have imagined, bigger than any single lawsuit or single news story. "You shook the ground," Eleanor said firmly. "Now let them rebuild better, or let them fall too." Outside, the city buzzed with the news. Across the country, other companies called emergency meetings. Public figures made hollow apologies. Shareholders demanded audits. CEOs whispered nervously behind closed doors, wondering if their walls would hold or if they, too, would crumble under the same truth that had ripped through Crestline Airways. Brielle didn't need to be part of those rooms. She had already done her part. She had already left her mark. And not with screaming, not with violence, but with quiet, steady courage that outlasted all their noise. As the night deepened and the city lights blurred into long golden rivers, Brielle sat quietly by the window. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just watched, knowing the world she woke up to tomorrow would not be the same world it had been this morning. Not for her. Not for anyone. And deep inside, a small, fierce light burned. Not of pride, but of something even stronger. Hope. Real, untamed hope. Born not from what was given, but from what was taken back. And from the simple, powerful fact that when it mattered most, she had stood. The hours stretched long into the night, but the world refused to sleep. Crestline Airways was no longer just a company under fire. It had become a symbol of everything that had been whispered about in boardrooms, written about in quiet editorials, and muttered in employee break rooms for years. Every major news channel carried the story. Every social media feed buzzed with new leaks, new testimonies, new outrage. Former employees came forward, some anonymously, others bravely showing their faces, telling stories of discrimination, mistreatment, and silencing. One by one, the pieces of the company's careful image fell apart. News anchors used words like systemic, long-standing, and deeply rooted without hesitation. No one tried to defend Crestline anymore. It had no defenders left. Inside the quiet office tower, Eleanor Jenkins remained by Brielle's side. They had moved to a smaller lounge area, away from the desk, where heavy curtains muffled the city noise and the warm lighting softened the hard truth spilling in from outside. A tray of untouched food sat between them, but neither woman had the appetite for it. Victor Hale entered the room quietly, carrying a tablet loaded with the latest reports. He handed it to Eleanor, who scrolled through it slowly, her face showing little emotion. After a few minutes, she set it aside and turned to Brielle. "They're offering settlements to employees who are coming forward," Eleanor said, her voice low. "They're trying to close mouths before the courts open them." Brielle wasn't surprised. That was how companies survived, or tried to. Money, hush agreements, promises to do better that were written carefully in contracts but never in hearts. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, watching Brielle with a sharp, thoughtful gaze. "You have a choice now," she said. "You can let them handle it in the courts. Let the government investigations do what they can. Or ... Brielle turned to her, already sensing where this was going. "Or you can push it even further," Eleanor finished. Silence filled the room for a long moment. Brielle considered the weight of it. She was tired, more tired than she had ever been. Her body ached with it. Her mind pulled thin like paper left too long in the rain. Part of her wanted to hand everything over to lawyers, to reporters, to the system that was finally grinding into motion. Let them fight it out while she disappeared back into normal life. But another part of her, deeper and fiercer, knew better. The system had failed her before, failed people like her 1,000 times before. What had changed wasn't the system, it was her willingness to let it be enough. She straightened slowly, her hands resting firmly on her knees. "I'm not done," she said, her voice steady. "Not yet." Eleanor smiled, a rare, proud smile that softened her sharp features. "Good, because they're not just afraid of lawsuits or fines, Brielle. They're afraid of voices, of truth that keeps speaking even when they throw money at it to stay quiet." Victor stepped forward again, placing a thick folder on the coffee table between them. "We prepared this earlier," he said. "It's a public statement, one that won't get buried under legal paperwork or corporate spin. You'll have full control over it. No edits, no restrictions." Brielle reached out and touched the folder, but didn't open it yet. She wasn't afraid. She was thinking. Not about revenge, but about impact. About the thousands of people she didn't know who had felt the same sting she had at Gate 42. About the silent battles fought every day in offices, stores, schools, airports, and streets. "This isn't just about Crestline," she said quietly. "It's about every place like it that thinks if they build their walls high enough, no one will hear the people outside knocking." Eleanor nodded. "And tonight you're knocking a little louder." Brielle finally opened the folder, scanning the statement. It was simple, honest, no dramatic language, no blame games. Just the truth. The truth about what had happened. The truth about what it meant. The truth about why it couldn't be ignored anymore. Victor handed her a pen. She signed her name at the bottom without hesitation. At the same time, across the city, television studios prepared for breaking news broadcasts. Public relations teams scrambled to update their scripts, realizing too late that no prepared statement from Crestline Airways could match the raw power of the truth coming from Brielle Jenkins herself. At 11:58 p.m., the statement was released online through major media outlets, advocacy groups, and Brielle's newly created official account. It spread faster than anything Crestline's executives could have imagined. By midnight, Brielle Jenkins was trending in 37 countries. By 1 a.m., global news anchors read pieces of her statement live on air. By 2 a.m., several major airlines announced immediate internal reviews of their own practices. The world didn't sleep that night. It listened. And somewhere high above the chaos, sitting quietly in a soft chair by a dark window, Brielle watched the distant lights of the city flicker under the weight of a change she had helped unleash. The fight wasn't over. Maybe it never would be. But tonight the silence had been broken. And that was enough. For now. It was enough. The early hours of morning rolled in slowly, carrying the faint light of dawn and the city that had not truly slept. A quiet buzz hung in the air, thick with the weight of change. Television screens and restaurants, hotel lobbies, airports, and living rooms replayed Brielle's statement over and over, her calm words breaking through layers of practiced corporate apologies that the public had grown used to ignoring. But this time, they listened. In neighborhoods far from towering glass offices, families sat around kitchen tables, reading articles out loud, their coffee growing cold. Workers at bus stops scrolled through their phones, nodding quietly to themselves. Students shared clips in group chats. Taxi drivers discussed it between rides. It was no longer just Brielle's story. It had become a reflection, a mirror held up to a society that had looked away for too long. Brielle, still sitting by the wide window in Eleanor's office, watched the sky shift from black to a deep bruised blue. She hadn't slept. She hadn't even tried. Sleep felt impossible when the air itself seemed to hum with the knowledge that something irreversible had happened. Across the room, Eleanor slept lightly in her chair, a blanket draped over her knees. Victor Hale remained awake, standing quietly by the door, checking his phone now and then, but never intruding. He understood the weight Brielle carried better than most. Some battles were not fought with fists or slogans, but with silent endurance, and Brielle was carrying the weight of more than just her own experience now. The soft buzz of Victor's phone broke the stillness. He answered quickly, his voice low. After a short exchange, he crossed the room to Brielle. "It's starting," he said simply. Brielle stood slowly, her body stiff from sitting too long. She pulled the blanket around Eleanor's shoulders more securely, then nodded at Victor to lead the way. They took a service elevator down to the basement level, where a private car waited. Victor opened the door for her, and she slipped inside without a word. As the car pulled out into the quiet streets, Brielle leaned her forehead against the cool glass, watching as the city came alive. It wasn't the usual rush of traffic and impatient commuters. It was slower, more careful, as if the city itself understood it was stepping into a different day. They drove toward a small building tucked between two towering skyscrapers downtown. It wasn't flashy, just a simple brick structure with a brass plaque that read, "Office of Public Accountability." Victor escorted Brielle inside. The building's hallways were lined with simple framed photographs, not of politicians or business leaders, but of ordinary people, teachers, factory workers, nurses, bus drivers, people who had made a difference, not because they were famous, but because they refused to be silent when it mattered. At the end of the hall, a room full of reporters, activists, and community leaders waited. They rose as Brielle entered, not with applause, but with a deep, heavy respect that made her chest tighten. No stage had been built. No microphone towers or flashing banners announced her arrival. It was a simple wooden podium with a plain black microphone. A single sheet of paper rested on the surface, though Brielle didn't need to read it. She walked slowly to the podium, her heart pounding steadily, not with fear, but with something closer to certainty. When she spoke, her voice was low but carried through the room without hesitation. "I didn't ask for this to happen," she began. "I didn't wake up one day wanting to bring down a company. I just wanted to be treated like I mattered." The room leaned in closer, hanging onto every word. "But when I was shouted at, humiliated, and treated like I didn't belong, I realized something," she continued. "It wasn't just me. It was happening everywhere, all the time, to people whose stories don't make the news. People who are told with a look, with a word, with 1,000 little cuts that they are less, that they are not welcome, that they don't deserve a place at the table." She paused, letting the silence wrap around her words before she pressed on. "I didn't destroy Crestline Airways. Their choices did that, their culture did that. I simply refused to stay quiet about it, and I will not stay quiet when I see it happen again. Not here, not anywhere else." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others nodded, faces set with quiet anger and fierce hope. Brielle looked down for a moment, gathering her final thought, then raised her gaze once more. "This isn't about one airline. This is about how easy it is to look away when it's not happening to you. About how dangerous it is when we choose silence because it's easier than choosing justice." She stepped back from the podium, her statement complete. She didn't wait for cheers. She didn't need them. Her truth didn't require applause. It stood on its own, solid and unshakable. As she moved away from the podium, people rose from their chairs, not in wild excitement, but in a powerful, silent standing ovation. A show of respect, not just for Brielle, but for every quiet fight fought by those who refused to bow their heads. Outside, the sun finally broke free from the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the city. And somewhere, deep inside the streets and buildings and hearts of people who had heard her, something shifted. Not everything was fixed. Not every wall had crumbled. But cracks had formed. And cracks, when left long enough, had a way of bringing down even the tallest towers. Brielle Jenkins walked out of the building into the new morning, knowing one simple truth. She had not ended a company. She had helped begin something much bigger. The morning light felt different against Brielle's skin as she stepped outside the Office of Public Accountability. The sun wasn't harsh or blinding. It was soft, golden, casting long, gentle shadows across the sidewalks, as if even the city itself was cautious, careful not to disturb the fragile beginning of something new. A small crowd had gathered outside the building, not angry protesters or frantic reporters this time, but ordinary people. Some held hand-painted signs. Others carried nothing but their tired, determined faces. There were mothers pushing strollers, teenagers with backpacks slung over their shoulders, construction workers in dusty boots, teachers with their lanyards still around their necks. They had come not because they had been called, but because they had felt pulled to be here. As Brielle stepped onto the sidewalk, a hush spread over the crowd. For a second, she thought they might cheer or shout slogans the way people did at rallies. But instead, a quiet ripple of respect moved through them. Heads nodded, hands pressed over hearts. Some simply stood with arms folded, gazing at her with a mixture of gratitude and hope. Victor Hale stood nearby, watchful but unobtrusive. He knew this moment wasn't about security or arrangements. It was about something raw, something real that no press release or corporate apology could recreate. An elderly woman with a kind, lined face stepped forward first. Her name was Margaret Fields, though Brielle didn't know it yet. She wore a simple floral dress and walked with a limp, using a cane carved from dark wood, much like Eleanor's. She didn't speak. She simply reached out and pressed a small folded note into Brielle's hand, squeezing her fingers gently before stepping back into the crowd. Others followed. A young man in a delivery uniform gave her a quiet nod. A mother pulled her young daughter forward to wave shyly. An older man in a mechanic's jacket clapped his hand over his heart, blinking back tears he didn't bother to hide. Brielle didn't know what to say, so she didn't say anything. She let the moment live on its own, powerful without being pushed. She opened the note when she got to the car. In shaky handwriting, Margaret had written, "Thank you for standing when so many of us could not. You didn't just carry your burden today. You carried ours too." Brielle closed her eyes, her hand resting lightly over the words. Victor opened the car door and she slid inside. As they drove through the city, the world she had known, the one filled with quiet injustices and shrugged shoulders, looked different now. Not because it had magically healed, but because it could no longer pretend to be untouched. They passed a newsstand where rows of newspapers carried her picture on the front page. Some showed the moment she walked past the shouting flight attendant. Others captured her standing at the podium, eyes steady, voice unshaken. The headlines varied, but they all shared one thing: the acknowledgement that something had changed. The girl who didn't step back. One voice, one call, one collapse, and crestline fallout, the face of courage. The car slowed as traffic thickened. Victor turned the radio on low, and Brielle listened as commentators discussed the wider effects of the fall. Other airlines were announcing emergency reviews of their policies. CEOs were resigning overnight. Shareholder meetings had turned ugly. Civil rights groups were organizing campaigns not just against Crestline, but against industries that had operated unchecked for decades. And all of it traced back to one moment, one girl, one refusal to accept silence as her answer. Brielle leaned back against the seat, her body aching with exhaustion but her spirit sharper than it had ever been. She knew people would try to twist the story in the days ahead. Some would call it an overreaction. Some would accuse her of wanting fame. Some would beg for forgiveness not because they meant it, but because they feared being the next to fall. None of that mattered. The truth was bigger than the noise. As the SUV crossed over the bridge heading toward the quieter edges of the city, Brielle glanced out at the water below. The river ran strong, carving its way through rock and dirt, shaping the land in slow, unstoppable movements. It reminded her of something Eleanor had said years ago when Brielle was still a little girl, struggling to understand why the world so often felt unfair. You don't have to tear down every wall with your bare hands, Brielle, Eleanor had told her. Sometimes all it takes is one crack in the right place. Water finds the crack, it does the rest. She smiled faintly now, understanding those words better than she ever had before. She hadn't destroyed Crestline Airways by herself. She had simply found the crack, and the truth, like water, had rushed in and done what truth always does when given enough time. It had worn away the lies until the whole structure collapsed under its own weight. As the city skyline faded behind her, Brielle Jenkins closed her eyes and finally allowed herself a breath she hadn't been able to take since that awful moment at Gate 42. A breath free of anger, fear, or humiliation. A breath full of something else entirely. Something powerful, unshakable, and quiet as the rising sun. Freedom. Real freedom. Not the kind you're handed, but the kind you claim for yourself, and then protect for others. The kind that even 1,000 closed doors couldn't take away once it was yours. The kind that lasted. The SUV continued its quiet journey out of the city, the hum of the tires blending with the low murmur of the distant traffic. Brielle watched as the towering skyscrapers gave way to smaller buildings, the sharp edges of the city softening into tree-lined streets and rows of modest homes. Out here, the world felt less complicated. No news vans blocking sidewalks, no executives scrambling to save themselves, just normal people living their lives, unaware that somewhere a crack had formed that would eventually reach them too. Victor Hale kept his eyes on the road, respecting Brielle's silence. She needed time, and he was wise enough to know that healing didn't happen with forced conversations or heavy speeches. Sometimes it happened in long stretches of road, in the slow passing of neighborhoods, in the simple sound of breathing easier than you had the day before. Brielle leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. Her mind wandered, replaying the events of the last 24 hours in pieces. The sharp shout from Colleen Briggs, the cold stares of strangers, the heavy silence before her quiet call, then the tidal wave that followed, the executive scramble, the leaked documents, the shutdown of an empire built on appearances rather than truth. A small part of her still couldn't believe it. That one voice could trigger so much. That standing her ground could shift the earth beneath a giant's feet. As they drove, Victor turned onto a narrow gravel road that wound through a cluster of trees. At the end of the path stood a modest farmhouse, white paint weathered by years of sun and rain, windows glowing warmly against the gray morning light. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and a rocking chair creaked gently on the front porch. This was Eleanor's private home, the place she had retreated to after years of boardrooms and business wars. Here, the world moved slower, measured not in stock prices but in seasons, harvests, and the quiet rhythm of living honestly. Victor parked the car and got out first, opening Brielle's door. She stepped onto the gravel, feeling it crunch under her sneakers. The smell of damp earth and wood smoke filled the air, grounding her in a way nothing else could. Eleanor was already waiting on the porch, wrapped in a thick knitted shawl, her cane resting lightly against the chair. She smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached her sharp, clear eyes. Brielle climbed the steps and sank into the empty chair beside her. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. They simply sat, watching the breeze stir the long grass and the first rays of true sunlight stretch across the field. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "You know it doesn't end here," she said quietly. Brielle nodded. She knew. "There will be others," Eleanor continued. "Other companies, other gatekeepers, other doors closed without reason. This fight doesn't wrap itself up neatly because one company fell." Brielle leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "I know," she said, "but it has to start somewhere." Eleanor smiled again, this time with something deeper behind it. Pride, maybe, or hope, or the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had fought her own battles long before anyone knew her name. "It did," Eleanor said. "It started with you." They sat in comfortable silence after that, listening to the sounds of the morning, the chirp of birds, the low rustle of trees, the distant bark of a dog somewhere down the road. Brielle let the peace wash over her, sinking into her bones. She wasn't naive enough to think she had changed the whole world overnight. The roots of injustice ran deep, tangled beneath centuries of excuses and indifference. But she had proved something, not just to Crestlane Airways but to herself. She had proved that silence was not the only option, that standing up, even when your voice shook, even when your hands trembled, was worth it. That dignity was not something given by others, but something you could claim and protect for yourself. Inside the house, Victor started a pot of coffee, the rich smell drifting out to the porch. Eleanor patted Brielle's hand once before pushing herself up slowly with her cane and heading inside, leaving Brielle alone with her thoughts. The field stretched out before her, open and wide and endless. And for the first time in a long, long time, Brielle Jenkins didn't feel like she was standing at a locked door. She felt like she was standing at the beginning of a road built not by permission, not by invitation, but by every step she took forward. The fight would continue, the walls would resist, but the cracks had formed. The river of truth was running through them. And Brielle knew now. She was not just a passenger waiting for a gate to open. She was the storm waiting just beyond the horizon. Quiet, steady, unstoppable. And the world would never again be able to pretend she hadn't arrived. The day grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, spilling golden light across the fields and filling the air with the smell of fresh earth. The farmhouse creaked softly as the wood warmed under the sun, and a few birds settled on the porch railing, chirping lazily as if they too were part of this moment. Brielle remained seated in the rocking chair, her fingers brushing over the worn armrests as she stared out at the endless landscape. It was peaceful here, but it wasn't the kind of peace that came from escape. It was the kind of peace born after surviving something that tried to crush you and knowing it had failed. Inside, Eleanor and Victor moved quietly, giving her space to absorb the weight of everything that had happened. They understood better than anyone that battles fought inside your heart took longer to heal than battles fought with words or fists. Brielle's mind drifted back to the beginning, to the girl who had stood at gate 42 with her backpack clutched tightly, her heart hammering in her chest as strangers stared and judged. She remembered the heat of humiliation rising up her neck, the trembling in her hands, the crushing urge to run and disappear. But she hadn't run. She had stayed. She had made the call that changed everything, not knowing where it would lead, only knowing she couldn't accept being stepped over one more time. And now, here she was, sitting in the aftermath. Her phone buzzed gently in her pocket, breaking the stillness. She pulled it out and found it flooded with messages, texts from classmates she hadn't spoken to in months, emails from journalists asking for interviews, notifications from social justice groups praising her courage. There were hateful messages too, mixed in like bits of glass hidden among the flowers. Accusations that she had ruined livelihoods, that she was chasing attention, that she didn't understand the real world. Brielle scrolled past them, unfazed. The real world was exactly what she understood. She had been living in it long before the cameras showed up, a world where some people were allowed to belong without question and others had to fight for every step they took. She turned the phone off and set it face down on the armrest. Not today. Today wasn't about proving anything to anyone. Today was about remembering who she was before the noise, before the headlines, before the moment she became a symbol for something bigger than herself. Behind her, the screen door creaked open, and Eleanor stepped out with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She handed one to Brielle without speaking, settling back into her chair with a soft sigh. For a while, they just sat there, 2 generations connected by the same silent understanding. They had fought different battles, in different times, but the core of it remained the same. Dignity, voice, refusal. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice low and firm. You realize they're going to write stories about you now. Speeches will mention your name, maybe even history books if they get it right. Brielle smiled faintly, watching the steam rise from her cup. Let them, she said. I know what really happened. And what's that? Eleanor asked, her eyes twinkling. Brielle sipped her coffee, letting the warm bitterness settle on her tongue before she answered. I stood up, she said simply, when it was easier to sit down. I spoke when it was safer to stay quiet. And I didn't do it for a headline. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Eleanor nodded slowly, pride shining in her tired eyes. That's all that ever really matters, she said. They sat together long after the coffee cooled, the sun rising higher in the sky, casting long stretched shadows across the fields. The farmhouse behind them stood sturdy and strong, weathered by years of storms, but still standing. A reminder that strength wasn't always loud or violent. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was just the decision to stay upright when everything else tried to push you down. As afternoon crept closer, Brielle stood and walked to the edge of the porch, feeling the soft wind lift strands of her hair. The open field stretched out in front of her, endless and waiting. There were no gates here, no lines telling her where she could and couldn't stand, no voices shouting her back. She stepped off the porch onto the grass, the ground firm beneath her feet. Each step she took felt lighter, freer, as if the weight she had carried for so long was finally lifting piece by piece. The world beyond the fields was still broken in many ways. There would be other fights, other injustices, other moments when it would be tempting to stay silent. But Brielle knew she would not be silent. Not now. Not ever. She had found her voice. And more importantly, she had found her strength. A strength built not from anger, but from truth. A strength not dependent on applause or headlines or validation. A strength that lived inside her, unshakable and sure. As she walked farther into the field, the wind pressed gently against her back, like a silent encouragement to keep moving forward. And she would. One step, one voice, one stand at a time. Because change didn't happen when giants chose to be kind. It happened when ordinary people like her refused to back down. And Brielle Jenkins was done backing down. She was walking into a future she had helped carve open, with the whole wide sky stretched out before her, vast, limitless, and entirely her own. If you liked this story, make sure to give this video a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories.